It's the morning of September 13th, 2010. I'm Michael Aron of NJN News. We're at the Eagleton Institute at Rutgers for the Rutgers program on the governor, the Thomas H. Kane Archive. This morning we're going to talk to Saul Cooperman. Saul was Tom Kane's education commissioner through 2 terms. He had been in education in New Jersey in a number of different school districts when Governor Kane plucked him out and installed him as commissioner in the spring of 1982. And he and Tom Kane achieved a number of education reforms that we're going to talk about this morning. Morning, Saul. Good to see you.
Michael.
How did you come to join the Kane administration?
I got a call, which surprised the heck out of me because I wasn't involved in politics and I didn't know Tom Kane. So he didn't call. One of his people called and said, "We'd like to interview you." And that's how it started.
What were you doing at the time?
I was superintendent in Madison.
You're a native New Jerseyan?
All the way.
Born in Newark?
Born in Newark, raised in West Orange, and my master's and doctorate were from Rutgers.
And then you went right into teaching or administering schools?
Yeah, teaching for 4 years, high school principal for 4, and then superintendent in 2 districts, 13 years total.
Madison and?
Well, it was actually Montgomery Township near Princeton, and then Madison.
And had you been interested in state politics before? No?
No, I was not involved in the Superintendent's Association. I basically did curriculum work and got involved in policy issues, and I didn't hold any position in politics. I was not an officer or anything.
So how did they find you?
I have no idea. I really don't.
Do you remember who called?
It might have been Daggett, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure.
And how did you receive this inquiry?
Surprise, but I thought, what a great opportunity, and I thought all appointments were going to be made by close political associations, and since I didn't know Kane, I thought, I'm going to get an interview, I'm going to tell him everything I believe, nothing to lose. And we went to some abandoned building, it was very secretive, and Carrie Edwards was there, and Chris, Gary Stein, and I remember a close friend of Tom Kane's who was a Catholic priest, and I can't remember his name, but he was there too. And so it was eerie because in this deserted building, they interviewed me for about an hour and a half.
Was Kane there?
No, he was not there. He was not there.
Presumably they liked you because did you ever sit with the governor before he named you?
Yeah, there was one interview I had before, and I met with him, and I thought the interview was very good. And I came home and told my wife, I said, this could get serious, because I thought it was all fun and games. And then he picked someone else. He picked a guy named Aron Lewis, who I thought was a great appointment. And, you know, so I didn't know, was I the second choice, was I the 4th choice, or anything. But then Lewis was accused of plagiarism, and then I got the call from Kane.
So Lewis was named, and he was to be the commissioner. Did
Right.
he even start work in Trenton, do you know?
No.
Was he from Pennsylvania?
I don't know if he was from Pennsylvania. I know he was the superintendent of Plainfield.
In Plainfield.
And he was, from my point of view, although I didn't know Ron, I thought it was a good choice. I had lived in Plainfield, so I knew the problems of Plainfield. I knew some of the things he had done. But the plagiarism came out within a couple of days after he was nominated.
So presumably you were the number 2
Yeah, right.
choice originally, right?
That's correct, yeah.
You say you thought this was a good opportunity to at least share with the governor your ideas about education. What were your ideas back then about education. What message did you want to send to this relatively new governor?
Well, the most important meeting I ever had with Tom Kean was the first. I had been nominated, but I had not officially been appointed, and he wanted to see me. So I came down there, and I had read everything that he had written on education. I just went to all the newspapers and read anything he had. I was my own clip service. And so when I met with him, I said, Governor, and I didn't know him to call him Tom, so Governor, you've talked a lot about excellence. I see the word all the time, excellence. We've got to restore excellence in education. What do you mean by excellence? And he smiled, that gap-toothed smile, and he said, why do you think I'm hiring you? So I knew when to shut up, and I said, I'll be back in 2 weeks with some ideas. And I came back in 2 weeks, and basically what I outlined was our first 3 or 4 years. And I said to him that teachers are the core, and if you've got good teachers, you're going to have a better education system and kids are going to learn. And he was interested in that, and I knew that he was a teacher, so I had a receptive audience. And I said, first of all, we've got to recruit teachers. You've got to get them here. And I explained what the alternate route was. I didn't have a name for it then, but I told him what it was. And I said, and we've got to hire 3 or 4 people, and we've got to be very aggressive. Rather than saying teachers will love New Jersey, we've got to go out from Maine to maybe Washington, D.C., and we've got to recruit teachers. And once we get them in, we've got to pay them well. And then we've got to develop teachers, and that became then the Academy for Teaching. And we've got to challenge them, and that became a grant program with replication. And I asked him if he would want to attack seniority, which was a pet of mine. You know, teachers have to be laid off. They're laid off by seniority, not by competence. And then finally was a recognition program to recognize great teachers. And that was the whole deal, from recruitment to recognition and a lot in between. And he bought it all. He said, that's really good. And he said, can you do it? And I said, yes. And that was our first meeting. I never forgot that.
And how long did it take to do all that?
It took about 4 years. That was a lot of the first term. There were other things, but the alternate route was a Donnybrook, because that was going to challenge all of the teacher education. They had a monopoly on who becomes a teacher, and so people were flying in from all over the United States to say what a bum I was and what an ingrate I was, because I got my master's and doctorate in education. So it was in retrospect, it was a fun time. At the time, it was not so much fun.
Was the alternate route successful?
Oh yeah, we had independent evaluations. We got benefits that we didn't even think we were going to have. Out of 26 majors that the colleges give for teaching certification, in all but one, alternate route scored much higher on teacher exams. The only one they didn't was vocational education, and those are very small numbers of kids that are addressed.
I'm not sure I understand the point you just made.
Okay.
Of 26 majors in a college education program?
Yes.
Say it again.
Okay. In New Jersey, when we take all of our teacher training institutions, there are 26, or there were 26 majors then. English, language, social studies, mathematics, and so on. There are 26 areas you can be certified in. And the alternate route scored higher in 25 out of 26. We were able to tap people who wanted to teach but didn't want to quit their jobs and then go back to a teacher training institute. So we could get people from your alma mater, Princeton. We could get them from mine, Lafayette, and we did, because we recruited. One of the benefits is we had something like, I think, 3 or 4% minority teachers coming out of our teacher training institutes, and that doubled when we had the alternate route. And we didn't even really think that that was going to happen, but it did. So it was a very successful program and endures to this day, and almost every other state has copied it.
Were we first?
We were first. Oh, yeah. First.
I remember doing stories on the alternate route. I remember the Dodge Foundation being active in pushing that.
Yes.
Was it hard to get it through the legislature?
Oh, God, yes. After we announced it, I think almost all of the assembly were against it. And we had to peel people off, one after the other after the other. And finally, the breakthrough was when John Rocco and Joe Doria came to smoke the peace pipe. And then we knew we had won.
Rocco was a Republican, and he was the chairman of the Assembly Education Committee at one point in time.
Good memory.
Doria was a Democrat and would be a leader. I don't know if he was a leader at... Oh, I guess he also was on the Education Committee.
That's right. That's right.
So they were key in getting this through?
Yes. Yes. In not blocking it and letting it go through the way we wanted it, because as you know, people will say to your face, oh, we're for it, that's really great. And then you get into amend, 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 and then a cow becomes a horse, becomes a goat. So we were able to get it through as we wanted it. And Joe and John, after fighting it for a long time, they came on our side.
Who was opposing it? Who was the strongest opposition?
Schools of education.
Trenton State College?
Yes.
Who else?
Everyone in New Jersey.
Rutgers
was
program
against
in
it.
Education?
Oh yeah, they're really against it. In fact, there's a fun story now. A couple of people told me that someone had mentioned me for a distinguished alumni award, and the education people knocked it down and finally said, Cooperman, we don't want him. In fact, there's a story, this may not be on the tape in the final analysis, but it reminds me, when I was asked to be in Phi Delta Kappan, which is an honorary society, education society, and at that time, to be in, you had to do one of two things. You had to have an original idea, or you had to take someone's dissertation and say, is it applicable today? Well, I had this idea, this was back in 69 or 70, and I had the idea for the alternate route. So I wrote it down. And I can remember, I was a high school principal at the time, and the guy who was the superintendent at Belvedere called me into his office. And there were tears in his eyes. And I thought, oh my God, someone's died in his family. And he said, Saul, I am so, so sorry. And I said, what happened, Mr. Billette? And he said, well, as you know, there were 20 people from New Jersey nominated to be in Phi Delta Kappan, and 19 got in. You didn't. And it was because I had, this is my political smarts, I was dumb, really dumb. I had recommended to education professors that they no longer have the monopoly on the certification of teachers, that we do the alternate route. That was in 69, 70. So
had you published that idea somewhere?
No, I just had the idea. I wrote about it then, and I didn't get into Phi Delta Kappan.
The program Teach for America recruits people from other avenues of life to go into inner cities and become school teachers. Right. Was that based on your idea?
You'd have to ask Wendy Kopp. She was attending Princeton at the time that the alternate route came out. And I had started a nonprofit board, and Wendy was on the board. And so I asked her that question. I said, "Hey, Wendy, you copy our stuff and for Teach for America?" And she said, "Well, you know, it's kind of influenced, but she said it was my own idea." So I take it for that. That's okay.
So to recruit better teachers, you push the alternate route, but you also mentioned pay. I well remember a big fight over minimum pay for teachers back in the 80s. I think the minimum you wanted was $17,500. Is that
Up one, Michael.
$18,000?
$18,500.
$18,500.
Yeah.
What were teachers being paid back then? As low as what?
In the southern part of the state, you know, and I cherry-picked the counties, but in some of the counties, Gloucester, Cape May, and so forth, it was $12,500. And I might add that when we started to discussing this very seriously, I can remember one time that I was asked to come to a meeting, and Gary and Chris and Carrie, everyone was there with Tom Kane. And we were each to express our viewpoints. And they all expressed a viewpoint that this was a dumb idea, and this would raise taxes, and it would also have an inertial effect on all salaries. Because if the beginning teachers made $18,500, the teachers who were making $16,000 would want $19,000 or $19,500. And I said, absolutely. That's the method to the madness, raise all salaries. I said, you got it. And they said, stupid idea, Cooperman, you know, and Kane was listening, and finally he said, we're going with Saul's idea. And so it was like 5-1 against me, but I got the one vote that counted.
Why do you think that was?
I really think I like Tom Kane very much, and I think he's a smart guy, and I think ideas mean something to him. And I think good public policy means something to him. And so he saw that this was part of a plan. It was a mosaic. You bring teachers in and you don't pay them well, then why should they come in? But if you bring them in and say New Jersey has a beginning salary of $18,500 and then it goes up from there, you've taken the pay issue and you've made us you know, really competitive in that with our neighboring states, just what we do economically and corporate-wise and so forth. So I just think Kane was properly motivated. He wanted to do the right thing. I think it's as simple as that.
Was it, you say that the advisors predominantly were opposed to it for political reasons. Was it controversial
Yes.
once you tried to get it through the legislature?
Yes. Because mayors saw this as raising their taxes. It would. The only people that were really for it, and couldn't figure me out on that, because it first came the alternate route, and I was a bum to the teachers union. Now it's you know, I was the front guy on raising $18,500 and going all around the state, and so they say, well, maybe Cooperman's not a putz after all.
What were your relations with, let's start with the NJEA. What kind of relationship did you have with the NJEA?
I would say respectful, although we tangled a lot. You know, we just didn't agree. I saw the distinction between teachers who, for reasons I gave before, I think are the absolute heart of education. If you don't have good teachers, everything else goes down the drain. So, you know, a lot of what the Kane administration did was focused on teachers, respecting them, enhancing them, paying them, developing them, so forth. But the union, I had to tangle with them. I tangled with them on certification, even on the recognition. We held it in Jadwin Gym, and we wanted to do a really wonderful thing for teachers and bring them down, and we had white linen tablecloths. We had at that time, Bill Bennett was our first speaker. The second speaker was the head of ETS, Greg Anrig. So we wanted to make it a really great day. But the union was against it. And I even said to the head of the union at the time.
Who was that?
Edie Fulton. And I said to Edie, how can you be against this? We're recognizing teachers. It's a big deal. And she said, you're only recognizing one teacher per school. Therefore, you're disrespecting all other teachers. And I thought, this is the ultimate bull. I said, Edie, you know, it's crazy. We can recognize every teacher. We want to say this teacher is great, and here's why they're great, and they are representative of teachers. And then, it's funny you mentioned that. There was a guy, remember Marco Lacantina?
Remember the name,
Remember
yes.
the name? Oh, man, this is...
Who was he with?
He was with the teachers' union at the college level, who also had it in for me because of the alternate route. But we were going to hold this thing at Jadwin Gym, and we had, you know, a nice dinner planned and so forth. And one of my colleagues came to me and said, hey, Saul, we got a big problem. I said, what's a big problem? He said, Marco Lacantina has gotten the service workers, the cooks, to say they won't cook tomorrow. Now we're having hundreds of teachers down. We got Bill Bennett flying in from Washington. Kane's going to speak, and I'm going to be the introduction guy. And we got all these teachers, and we're going to have no food. So Marco said, you're going to have to cancel this. You can't do this. And I sat down, what are we going to do? And do you know Hoagie Haven?
Yeah,
Michael?
on Nassau Street.
On Nassau Street, yes. And so I sent a guy right down because my son loved Hoagie Hagen. We lived in Rocky Hill at the time. And I said, go down to Hoagie Haven and see if they can make like 200 hoagies tomorrow. Tuna fish, ham, turkey. Can they do it? And they said, yes, they'll do it. And I said, okay. I called Marco up. I said, Marco, I said, we are going to hold it. We're going to have hoagies from Hoagie Haven, and I'm going to get up there and I'm going to say the reason you're having hoagies is because Marco Lacantina, head of the AFT, told the cooks not to cook for you. He said, you wouldn't do that, would you, Saul? I said, damn right I will. And so the cooks cooked, and we had a nice thing.
The only loser there was Hoagie Haven.
Yeah, Hoagie Haven lost, right.
Well, how does a school decide which teacher among all teachers should be singled out for recognition?
We asked them to do that. We gave them some criteria that we thought would be appropriate, and that the kids learn. That would be important. That the teacher have the respect of colleagues. That the teacher involved in extra time after school. But we left it up to them. We said that they could select the teacher, and they all did, which was a funny thing. So the teachers didn't see any problem in choosing a teacher. The union saw a problem.
Was that something that you had to get through the legislature, or could you do that administratively?
Administratively, yeah.
So that was not controversial, except within the communities you've just described, the NJEA, the AFT, right?
No one else really cared.
You talked about a teacher academy. Was that one of the?
Yeah.
What was that?
That was a big deal. We felt that, and I said it, which further ticked off the colleges, that advancement on the salary guide was made and still is by credits accumulated, so that I know teachers in this state very, very well that will take a course in computers. There may be absolutely no transfer between their course in computers that they took and children learning. And there hasn't been, to my knowledge, ever a correlation between courses the teachers take and the ability to teach better in the classroom. So if this is so, then you have to ask the question, why are we paying all this money? Because we not only reimburse teachers to take courses at the college, but then we reimburse them by going up on the salary guide. Our point was, what makes a teacher better? What makes a teacher better? A very simple question. And if we got the answer to that, we would find out who is doing the great research in the universities, and have they made it practical? So between the researcher in the university and the teacher in the classroom, there can be a compatibility, and the student will profit. And that's what we tried to do in the academy. We said we'd bring teachers down, and the teachers would learn new teaching skills to better help students learn. This was fought by the NJEA because they had their own training. This was fought by the colleges. In fact, they started a rumor, you may have remember this one. They said I was going to be the chancellor of the University of Florida, and Cooperman is leaving New Jersey in a lurch. I had a sister in Florida, and I would go down every year to see my sister and an aging uncle and aunt. And they had somehow found out about this, and they said I was going to leave New Jersey. So there were a lot of dirty tricks played in this particular area. And we wanted this to be a freebie that, by that I mean that the schools would pay for the teachers to come down to the academy. But this was fought out in the legislature, and we only got half a loaf. We got half of our expenses from the school districts. I'm sorry, half of it was going to come from the legislature. The others, the teachers had to pay for themselves. And the loyal opposition felt that the teachers wouldn't pay, and they did. And they came down, and we had, for every course we gave, we had to turn people away, which of course delighted us because it was a big hit. And one time I said to Bob Braun, and you remember Braun, and I said, Bob...
He covered education for the Star Ledger.
Yep. And I said, Bob, why don't you write about the academy? I said, this is really good stuff. You can come down and see it. And I wanted a building like Eagleton. I wanted a building like this. And we ended up, because we didn't have the money, in an industrial park in Edison. And again, the loyal opposition said, Cooperman wanted a nice old building by a lake with big trees, and he got an industrial park. And they came to the industrial park. And so, you know, that was, I thought, one of the big successes. Bob wouldn't write about it because he said, what's to write about? There's no controversy. He never wrote about it.
Never wrote about it.
I pestered him for 8 years, and he wouldn't write about it.
I guess that's why I don't know a whole lot about it. Who taught the classes? Who taught the teachers? They came to an academy to learn new teaching methods. Who taught them?
Oh, I had a person that I worked with in Madison. Her name was Sybil Nadell. And my original thing was not to be a superintendent, was to be a director of curriculum. But when I was at Rutgers for my doctorate, I couldn't get a job as director of curriculum. And all the people at Rutgers said, you got to be a superintendent, you know, you got to be a superintendent. And finally I had 3 kids, wife, no job. My dream of director of curriculum was lost. I had to become superintendent. But my heart was always in how do children learn? And so I had hired Sybil, who is one smart cookie, and she was compatible with me of reading stuff of how do children learn, how do their brains work, how should teachers teach. And so I convinced her to come down to Trenton and be the head of the academy. She then hired like-minded people who were very, very capable. She hired teachers in this state. All of the instructors were teachers from this state. We started out with 1 course, 3 people. One guy's name was Ron Castaldo, and I can't remember the third, but we had 3 people. And near the end, we had something like 11 or 12 people, and we were teaching 5 or 6 courses. And that's the way it happened.
Does it survive the academy?
No.
What happened?
What happened under the Florio administration, they said they didn't have money, and so they cut the funding, and so it died.
You mentioned challenge grants. What were challenge grants?
We called them maxi grants. We said we'd give $10,000, it's a lot of money in those days, to a teacher who had a great idea. And they had to come before a board of people, other teachers, administrators, board members, who would choose the grants. And maybe we'd choose 10 grants a year, $100,000. And then we'd have them evaluated by a third party. So let's say you won a grant and some other people won a grant. And let's say at the end of the year, your grant got the results you said it would get. We would then say, okay, Michael, you now are going to have replication responsibilities. And the teachers love this because now the thing that they believed in all their life, but they couldn't take it beyond their classroom, now it was being backed by the state. Now the state was publicizing it. And we would bring them to the academy and we would say, here is Michael Aron's, and he's got this idea and it's been proven and it's been evaluated. Now if you want to replicate it, we'll give you $5,000 and you can replicate. So that's what it was. And of course the teachers loved it because they could do real research, they could get results, and others could profit by what they did. So it was a little idea, but it was a pretty good idea.
So there were teachers who hit the jackpot for $10,000 during the Kane administration?
Yeah.
And the NJEA didn't fight that one?
No, they didn't fight that.
You say that your interest was in curriculum.
Yes.
And in how kids learn. Where did that come from? When was that interest born in you?
I never thought I'd be a teacher. And when I decided to become a teacher, I found, discover things about yourself. And I was teaching economics, history, and sociology.
Where?
And North Plainfield High School. And I tried to find out what's the best way to teach. And one of the things I did in economics is I was teaching monopolistic competition. And the way I found that most people taught it, and I'd talked to other teachers in the school, is they would say, well, here's the Sherman Antitrust Act, and this, memorize it, you get it on the test. Here's the Lochner Act, memorize that, you get it on the test. And so what I did was I wrote to Procter & Gamble, and they were about to take over Folgers Coffee. And I asked them, what was their reason for taking over Folgers Coffee? And they told me that they thought, that this would be good for the country and so forth. And it was nice. They wrote me a letter back. And then I told the kids, I said, I'm going to put you in groups, and maybe 5 or 6, I don't remember. And I said, here's your assignment. You have to decide whether Procter & Gamble has a right to take over Folgers, or is it monopolistic competition and they are creating a monopoly and they're going to force out other coffee people simply because they got the power of Procter & Gamble. And I was amazed because here I was not talking, I was just standing there, and these kids were working, and the bell rang and they were still working. And I said, oh man, I've just learned something here. And so I started to try to get an interest in curriculum and what would work, what wouldn't work, how do kids learn, how do they not learn. And so I learned something about myself.
How old were you at the time?
I was 25. I just come out of the Navy.
What did you learn about yourself?
I learned that I really like kids, that I really like teaching, and that I guess I heard a different drummer than most teachers, and I found out that I didn't have to talk all the time, that if I challenged them, then I could use case study a lot, and I would do that and use a lot of case study, which others weren't using. There's a lot of preparation, a lot of work, but the kids seemed to like it. So I learned something about myself, that I didn't have to always be the center of attention to get the kids to learn.
That's interesting.
Hmm?
You think most teachers think they have to be the center of attention?
Yes, and that's not a criticism. It's that they teach the way they were taught, so it becomes a self-perpetuating thing. You know, it's I see my grandson when he plays Little League and he goes in the batter's box and he puts his hand out like this. And I said, "Hey, Tim, who the heck you think you are, Derek Jeter?" And he said, "Well, yeah." So they see Jeter, always say, "Time out, time out." He puts his hand up. So little kids were all doing this. And in basketball, because Larry Bird used to go, a stupid habit, he put his hand on his, you know, like this, and he'd lick and go on it. So they do what they see that their heroes have done, and teachers tend to teach like their heroes have done. So that when we've all been in school, that no matter, we've all been in school, and we see teachers teach, and we have a favorite teacher. And so if we become teachers, we try to emulate what we thought that teacher was. So I think, yeah, most teachers talk a lot. They could talk less, but that's why curriculum is important.
When you put the $18,500 floor in, what do you think the average teacher salary was at that time? 30,000, 35? What were teachers making generally in New Jersey in those days?
I don't have that at the tip of my tongue. I don't know. I know what the the beginning salary was. As I said, it was about 12,000. And
in the deep South. How about in North Jersey? How about in North Jersey? Were they already
higher.
making 18.5 in suburban northern New Jersey?
I can give you one example because of my daughter. My daughter was a teacher in Hillsborough, and thank God she got her job before I got it. Because they said, "What, did your father get you your job?" And she said, "I was teaching 3 years before my father got his job." But she came to me after the 18.5 was announced, and she was half kidding, and she said, "Hey, Dad, you know you're going to have a problem." And I said, "What's the problem, honey?" And she said, "I'm making 16.5 or 17." And she said, "Now the beginning teachers are making that. Am I still going to have to make that?" And I said, Good question, Suzanne. Your union will take care of that, I guarantee you," which they did.
So when you said earlier that that would bump all salaries up, that's what it did.
Yes, it did.
And that was fine with you?
Yes.
That was what you wanted?
Yes. And of course, Tom Kane knew that. He's a very smart dude, so he grasped that right away. So he knew that what he was going to do, if he accepted that, is there was going to be, and we had all the stats, and we tried to run them out of what the projections were, and what the union would do, and what the cost would be, and what the tax rates would be. So I presented that all to him so that it was all, clear, because I never wanted him to step on a rake. I wanted him to know that if I recommended something, there were consequences, and he bought it.
25 years later, we're in a climate where there's a lot of sentiment in this state that the education establishment sucks up too much money. What's your view on that?
I agree. I was on one side back in 1982, and now I think that we do pay a great deal of money, and we've got to have some sort of accountability and progress for that money. And I have no problem at all with teachers making $100,000, but I want to make sure that they are great teachers. I don't want it impossible to remove a teacher who is less than competent. And as I would not have a teacher railroaded by some administrator who just has it in for a teacher, on the other hand, I don't want a teacher who has lost his or her joy of life and abilities with children making $100,000. So I think the people who talk about removing incompetence are on the right road, but then you have to say, what is incompetence? How do you define incompetence? Who is going to decide on incompetence? What is their training? What is the ability of the teacher to push back against that administrator that wants them? So there's got to be due process. It's got to be very, very careful. But I think if you're going to pay $100,000, you got to get something for it.
Did you fight the tenure battle in your terms, either teacher tenure or superintendent tenure or principal tenure? Did you take those on?
All of the above. When it came time for the whole idea of the takeover, the bankruptcy of districts, the whole idea there was to remove the superintendent, to remove the director of curriculum, to remove the person who controlled the money, and to remove the person who controlled the personnel. Because in some of our urban areas, and we proved in a court of law, beyond any doubt, said the judge, that in Jersey City, Tony Cucci had his man who was appointing his friends as director of personnel. His son,
Tony Cucci was the mayor of Jersey City.
He was the mayor of Jersey City. He appointed the director of personnel. He appointed his son-in-law, Arsenio Silvestri, who was the business administrator. Now, by removing those people, we were removing tenured people. We also wanted it to come down to principals. We wanted to be able, with cause, which would be proven in a court of law, we wanted to remove principals. The NJEA won that one because they saw that coming too close to teachers. So they fought us on removing tenure from principals. And there's a sidebar story on this one, which I remember. One of my guys said, you got to see Carmen Orecchio and on this particular bill.
Carmen Orecchio was the senator from Essex County who was Senate president at a certain point in time. Was he Senate president at the time of this story?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And he was from Nutley. Your memory is wonderful. And Carmen was the Senate president. And so my guy, Bob Swissler, said, got to see Carmen in Nutley. And I said, I don't want to go up there. I'll see him when he comes down. I want to go see him in his office. And he said, no, it's very important. You go up and see Carmen in his office. So I went up and saw Carmen in his office, and I said, Carmen, this bill, this takeover bill is good for kids. And I said, it really is. And I said, I can take 5 minutes or 5 hours and go over anything you want. Saul, I know it's good for kids. And he said, it's a good bill. And I said, great. And I stuck out my hand and I said, thanks for your vote, Carmen. And he said, I didn't say I'd vote for it. Political lesson learned by Cooperman. And I said, what do you mean you're not going to vote for it? And he said, well, I'm in Nutley, and he said it's a tough district. And he said, I'll tell you what, would you give me 10 young people who will come and work for 1 week before the election and knock on doors and say, Carmen Orecchio is a friend of mine and he's a really good guy? And I said, Carmen, I can't do that. You know I can't do that. And he said, the NJEA can. And he said, your bill is important. But he said, there are a lot of other bills that are important. He said, I got to get reelected. And he voted against it. I didn't get enough votes. And the tenure of principals, which I wanted to do away with, and that was your question, I didn't get. And then also, and I don't know whether Tom Kane said this, but in the second term, I went in to see him, and I said, we've been pretty successful in what we've done. And he nodded. He knew something was coming. And I said, there's 2 other issues that might be good for you to tangle with. in your last term. And he said, what are they? And I said, consolidation and tenure. And he smiled, and he said, what do you have in mind? And I said, well, in consolidation, I said, I think we ought to appoint an absolute blue ribbon panel that is just untouchable. By their very names, people would know that they're not in for a con, they're not in because some organization put them in. And just ask them the question, should New Jersey consolidate districts? And if the answer is yes, how? And then take their recommendations. And he smiled and he said, yes, on tenure. And he said, what do you have in mind? And I said, we do away with teacher tenure. And we give them 5-year contracts which are renewable. And then we have a system put in that no teacher can ever be removed because of a capricious or arbitrary action by an administrator. I would defend that teacher, to the death. But there's got to be clear criteria. The criteria must be implemented by at least 2 administrators who have been trained. And if you have that, then after a 5-year contract, you can remove a teacher. And he said no. And it was the first time he said no to me, but he said no to the consolidation and no, and he told me a story. And I asked him about this like 2 years ago, and he said, I don't quite remember that. The story was this. He said, Saul, remember when we were kids, because we're the same age. He said, remember when we were kids and we used to see cowboys and Indians, and the cowboys had the wagons together, and the Indians are riding around shooting arrows at the cowboys? I said, yeah. And he said, we're the cowboys. And he said, lots of people shooting arrows. How many arrows do you want coming in? And I said, well, I think this is good, and he said, no. He said, we got too much going on now. And he said, if we do this, we could lose it all. And he said, not taking on those 2 issues.
And what do you think about that today?
I think he was wrong. But he's the governor, and I wasn't. So until this time, I've never publicly said anything about it.
So you didn't take on teacher tenure, you didn't take on principal tenure. Did you take on superintendent tenure?
Only in the districts where it was takeover, and of course the only district when I was around was Jersey City on takeover, and we took the tenure away from that superintendent. So that obviously was a precedent that it could be taken away. But then my term ended and I didn't continue under Florio.
Because I think at some point superintendent tenure was taken away, but it was not on your watch. It was later.
Correct. That's correct.
The takeover battle was very big in the second term, wasn't it?
Yes.
Explain what it was you were after with the takeover law.
I read business magazines, and I can remember the day I was sitting in my backyard reading Fortune. I was reading about a Chapter 11, of a takeover, removing the board, removing the CEO, putting it under new leadership, and trying to turn it around. And I remember that, under the Constitution, it says every child has the opportunity for thorough and efficient education. And, others will evaluate, my job and what I tried to do. But I had felt that we had a monitoring system, and there were some districts, mainly urban districts, that could not get out of the batter's box. In other words, one of the things you had to do is you had to have a curriculum. You had to have a written curriculum for the kids. And that's not the hardest thing in the world to do. You could hire people who are competent to have curriculum from kindergarten through 12th grade. So there were many urban districts that didn't even have the basics done. And we had this monitoring, and they were in level 1, and they'd fail that, and they'd go into level 2, and it was like spinning your tires. After level 2, they didn't succeed. We would tell them, you're bad boys, and then we would say, here's opportunities, we're holding these workshops, or why don't you go to this district and see how they've done it. But if they didn't pay any attention to us, we had no real power. So I thought, why don't we institute a Chapter 11 in schools? And I presented that to the governor, and I had it all, thought out. And
do you remember what year or how far into the 8-year term? About
the end of 86, beginning of 87.
Right, it was a second term issue.
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I think the court case was in 88. And there were people, once we came out with this, then people criticized us, but mainly me, and I think part of it was justified. They said, well, since you're doing this and this is unprecedented, the power of the commissioner's office, why don't you just do it? And if you care about, this was the toughest criticism I had, if you really care about kids, you say you care about kids, then why are you want to go through a court situation? Why don't you just do it? Do what you say you want to do, take it over, remove the superintendent, the business, the curriculum, and the personnel person, and try to turn this district around. And I thought that was a good criticism, but my point was we were under all sorts of attack. Republicans, it was a race issue, white guys, plantation politics. There were all sorts of criticisms of going after an urban district rather than trying to help the urban district. I tried to counter that by saying, I've been here for 5 years, and it doesn't seem, maybe my help hasn't been good, or maybe they haven't tried to take the help that I've offered. But the bottom line is kids are not learning. Kids are dropping out at unprecedented rates. And so something has to be done. This is my answer. You got a better answer, you tell me. Otherwise, this is my answer. And, that's what we tried to do.
Well, I remember a big fight in the legislature over takeover. Now, was that before you went to court against Jersey City that you had to get, or was that simultaneous with, or did that come later? What was the sequence there with the legislation and the court case?
Legislation first, court second. The legislation gave us a level 3. Level 3 said if you fail the level 2 in monitoring, then we give you so many months to do certain things. If you don't, we come in with a very unusual team. We would come in with an accountant, a lawyer, a cop really. We would come in with very unusual people, and we would tear into this district like never before, trying to turn over every rock to see what's going on. What makes the district run? Are people hired on merit, or are they hired on who you know and political connections? What is the superintendent's policy? How is the policies communicated? How are principals selected? All this sort of stuff. And a report came back to me in this level 3. This was all in legislation, and the battle was very, very tough. This has never been done before in the United States. So here we are saying a district which is sacrosanct, especially in good old New Jersey, where we had at the time 610 districts. I don't know how many there are now, but there were 610 districts. Each fiefdom was its own boss, local control. And so here we're challenging the whole deal. We got the legislation through. It went through. We were defeated the first time because we wanted to take tenure away from principals if we could prove their incompetence. When we lost that battle, Kane came back again. He worked very, very hard, and there were all sorts of pressures on us and wheeling and dealing. I remember one guy, Haynes, who was a Republican, and he
Burlington County or Burlington County. Yeah.
He wanted to make a deal and called me on the phone and said that he would vote for it if we widened a certain highway. I don't remember the name of the highway. If we I talked to Swissler. I said, "What the hell is this guy doing?" He said, "He owns land," and so he wanted the highway. So I told him I wasn't going to do it. So he said, "Why don't you call Hazel and Hazel Gluck?" And
he was the transportation committee.
Yes, you tell Hazel to do it. I said, "I can't do that." And he said, "You can, but you won't." And I said, "Okay, I won't do it." He voted against it.
Urban Democrats, did they vote against it?
Hell yes.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Suburban Democrats, how did they?
I don't remember. All I know is the second time we won the vote by a pretty good majority.
It sounds a little bit like No Child Left Behind from 20 years later. Is it similar to No Child Left? Was it similar to the idea behind the Bush No Child Left Behind?
With certain elements, yeah.
3 districts were taken over under that law. Jersey City first, I think Newark second, and Patterson third.
I'm not sure the order. You might be right.
It.
But I was only there for Jersey City.
Yeah, Newark was a big court fight in the 90s.
Yeah.
And now takeover is considered to have been only partially successful, and Jersey City has been returned to local control. And Newark has not. Newark is still a state-appointed superintendent. Patterson, I think, is still a state-appointed superintendent. What's your verdict on the program that you designed 25 years ago?
I think what you said is fair, partially successful. The only reason I wanted to stay on as commissioner under Florio because of Jersey City. That was my only reason. Because after 8 years of battering and so forth, but after the court case, there was a period, and you could look it up, I don't remember exactly, there might have been 5 or 6 months when it seemed like we were doing nothing. And then people said, certain people said, "You're phony, you got the law, but now you're not going to use it." These are the people trying to push me, use it. You know, Teddy Roosevelt, speak softly, big club. And I wasn't going to do that. I was going to make sure that I had overwhelming evidence that the district was corrupt to the core.
By going to court?
Yes. And I wanted to go to court because I wanted to prove beyond any doubt, rather than Saul Cooperman feels that a district is no good. I wanted to argue it in the court of law, and I wanted to win that way. And therefore it would be very hard for them to say that this was Cooperman's folly, or that he's got a vendetta, or anything that they would make up. That's why we went to court. And you know, our Janie LaVecchia, who is now on the Supreme Court, she was the assistant to Al Ramey. Janie was probably 26 years old, 27 years old, and we had these 2 lawyers, Ramey and LaVecchia, up against Shea Gould. This was Shea from Shea Stadium. And these guys came in, about 9 lawyers with $300 suits. Now,
representing Jersey City?
Yeah. A lousy school district, but great lawyers. And, you know, I said to myself, oh, God, Cooperman, you know, are we going to lose this in court? And, of course, we won, and the judge, you know, said some very nice things. And we had so much evidence. I'll tell you, my guys brought in boxes, and one box would say nepotism. The other box would say ripping off the medical and health system. Another box would say using workers to work on board members' homes. And I read each of these boxes. We had so much evidence. It was a case that we couldn't use at all of where did we lock it up real tight. So the stuff we used was, we thought, our best shot at winning. And even though they had good lawyers, we prevailed. And then we took over Jersey City, and I had about 6 months to go in the term, though it didn't work out time-wise for me. And what we were able to do in 6 months was change all their policies. Fire Franklin Williams, fire, I forget the name of the guy who was the head of personnel, fire Arsenio Silvestri, and make the district honest. But then time ran out for me, because that was the end of my 8 years. Florio was elected, and then he wanted another commissioner. So therefore, I did not continue.
You hinted a little while ago that you sought to stay on in the Florio administration. Did you approach them about being the commissioner?
They approached me. A guy by the name of Gus Rue was working for me. I trusted Gus very much. And Gus came to me and he said he had talked to Steve Persky, who is one of Florio's guys, and said that the governor-elect would like to meet with you and talk with you about possibly, continuing. And I said that would be great. And I then met with Persky, and I said, Steve, tell the governor that if he doesn't like my ideas, I will resign. Or if his direction is such that I'm not compatible with it, I will resign. And so he can get the commissioner he wants, because I felt very strongly about that. And Persky said, well, wait, you're going to talk with him. And then what I found out was like a month later, after Governor Florio had been in a month, that a guy by the name of Angelo Tommaso came to me, and he said, Saul, a woman by the name of Perry Fortalocchi is going around the state asking who would make a good commissioner. And I said, I can't believe this. So I called Perry, who I knew, and she started stammering and so forth. And I said, Perry, I'm not going to embarrass you anymore. You've given me the answer. And other superintendents then called me and said, they're going on. So I asked Persky, what the hell is going on? And he said, well, the governor's under pressure because he didn't like your decision in Abbott versus Burke, and it would be very difficult for him to have you continue. But he still does want to talk with you. But he does want to interview a couple of other people for the job. And I'm usually slow to simmer, but I do have a temper. And I just said to Persky, I said, I'm not competing for my job. I said, as you know, I have a contract. I've got 2 years to go on my contract. And I said, you'll have my resignation. And I handed in a resignation.
Were there 5-year terms for commissioners in those days?
Yeah, so I was reappointed and under Kane, so I had either 2 or 3 years to go under Florio. So I could have stayed, but that would have been meaningless.
It was a constitutional point that the education commissioner served longer than the governor, 5
Yes.
years instead of 4.
Yes.
We don't have that anymore? I think
No.
they did away with that?
Yes.
You say your position in Abbott versus Burke caused problems for Jim Florio. We haven't talked about Abbott versus Burke.
Right.
What role did you play in that long-running court case?
Well, it comes up, there's a decision by an administrative law judge, and then it comes to the commissioner and, winds its way up, ultimately to the Supreme Court if they hear it, and this one, of course, would. So when it came down to my decision, I basically made a decision it's more complex than this, but I said money is important if districts don't have books. Money is important if districts don't have science lab. And money is important if roofs are leaking. I said those are money issues. But the way we should attack this is we should use our monitoring system, our inspectorate, and we should find out what's wrong with the district. If it's money, we should give money. But if it's managerial incompetence, then we should deal with that. That's not money. And that, in essence, was my decision. The Supreme Court didn't agree. They said money was the issue.
Do you remember at what point in the 80s this came to a head?
It was first term. No, it was second term. So it was second term Kane. I don't remember the year. And
the Supreme Court said money is fundamental here.
Yeah. Yep.
And we've been fighting this fight for 35 years in this state.
Right.
And where do you stand today on this question?
I don't want to seem stubborn, but same place. I think if you've got an incompetent superintendent who is screwing it up, and I think one person can make a difference. One person is so important, and if you've got a capable leader, they can turn things around. And if you've got a jerk, they can screw it up. And so I think that sometimes it's not a money issue, it's a competence-incompetence issue. Sometimes it's a curriculum issue, sometimes it's a training issue. Those tend to be non-money things. So I think that money sure as heck is important. If children don't have eyeglasses and can't see, that's a money issue. If there's not a gym for kids or a library, that's a money issue. So I think you've got to parse it out, and you can't just say it's money. Everything's money.
So have we thrown too much money at Abbott schools over the past couple of decades?
I think that's ultimately what happened. It was 25 years after I made the decision, but that's where they are now. And they've said money is not the only issue. There are other issues. And so that's what the boys down the road here of the Education Law Center are still fighting, and bravo for them. They're good guys, and they want kids to learn too. We just respectfully disagree that money is everything.
And the last governor, Corzine, changed the school funding formula so that even suburban districts or even affluent districts would get some of this type of aid if they had needy kids in the district. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, and I had actually, years before, there was a guy in Washington by the name of Checker Finn, who is a real thinker. He is a guy who is many times way ahead of the crowd on educational issues, and he formed a group which basically said the money should follow the child, and he asked me to sign on to it. So I signed on years before Corzine made the decision. And what Checker did was he would go around the country trying to get people to buy into this concept of money following the child. So if Newark, of course, has lots of children who are in great need, and if they are in need, it's like inspection. I'm going to go to the doctor today and have my hearing checked, and if they find out I've got a problem, then they'll say, okay, Saul, your options are A, B, or C. Well, if we find a child who is not learning and is in a family of poverty, and they've moved 4 times within the last year, then they're doing a check on that kid, and when they find things wrong, there should be remedies, and remedies may take dollars, and then dollars should be given to a child like that.
There's a sense that American education is in crisis. Do you share that?
It's always in crisis. We want our children to learn. Brain power is what makes countries succeed or fail, and so yeah, I'm glad that I'm not trying to be flip, that there is crisis, because if people say it's crisis, they're going to pay attention, and hopefully the best minds will figure things out.
Do you think American schools have fallen behind their counterparts in other countries?
In some countries, especially in math and science, yes. But I think we are catching up. I think we've got capable leadership. I think in Washington, I am very impressed with Arne Duncan and his plans. I think he's absolutely on the right track, and I respect him and admire him.
How often did you meet with Governor Kane when you were Education Commissioner?
Probably once or twice a month. I don't actually remember.
You had to deal with the State Board of Education. What was its role when you were Education Commissioner?
It had two roles. Role number one was regulatory. So when the legislature passed the law, the State Board had to put it into code. So they had to crank it down to the next level, a practical school level. And that was a kind of minor responsibility, very tedious. The other one was if the commissioner, myself in this case, decided not to go to the legislature, then the board was the one who would make the decision. And I would tend to want to go to the board rather than do unilateral action for two reasons. One, I was used to dealing with boards, and second, I wanted public discussion of whatever I said. I knew lots of times I could have done things myself rather than go through the board. The risk of going through the board is that they would turn me down. But you know, that's an interesting dance, because you have a board who has authority to make decisions. You also have a governor. And at times, you almost play it like a violin, that the governor I saw as my real boss. I'd never do anything to get him into trouble or open my mouth that he didn't know about it. Yet on the other hand, I would sometimes tell him I want to go through the board rather than go through you. One of the things we discussed was the recognition program. So I didn't go through the legislature for that, I went through the board. The alternate route and the takeover, which I thought was super important, I had to go through the legislature.
Was the board a strong board, a weak board, easily manipulated, defiant? How did you see it?
I saw them as extremely bright people, and a great deal of respect for them. There are a couple of people every once in a while I thought were wheeling and dealing for their own sake, but mostly they were real solid people.
Do you remember who was president of the board during your time?
Yeah. David Brandt was president. He was a lawyer, a very, very bright guy, very fair guy. John Klagholz was president for quite a while.
He would become, oh, that was Leo Klagholz.
That was Leo, his brother.
Brother, okay.
Yeah, yeah. So those were the two when I was there. I'm not sure if Jim Jones was president for a year. He might have been, but I'm not sure.
It sounds from our discussion like you were an idea man. Is that what you've been in education for?
I'd like to be thought of that, yeah. Yeah.
You told me on our way in the door here this morning that you're working on an idea.
Right.
You have an idea?
Yeah, right.
You want to share it?
Sure. Schools haven't changed much since we were kids, and high schools really haven't changed at all. They're copycats of colleges. They have departments. They fight for turf. They fight for money. And I've had focus groups with over 100 kids. and I ask them what's good about school, what's bad about school, and just to sum it up, they see lots of good things about their school, but when they say what's not good is the bell rings, I have to put down Teddy Roosevelt, and I have to go in and learn about photosynthesis. The bell rings, I put down photosynthesis, and I have to learn about Longfellow. And there's no relation, there's no relevance, there's no connection. And what I want to do is I want to totally, here we go back again to my roots, I want to completely change the high school curriculum in the country. And I want to do it from a kid's point of view and still get in all the subjects. So for example, what kids do is they look up at the sky and say, where does it end? Who made it? And as we look at Stephen Hawking now, he says, God didn't make it. You know, science is responsible. Well, there's interesting debate. So I would teach three things. I would teach, first of all, the universe. The second thing I would teach would be individuality, a student about themselves, and then finally society. They have to act in a society. And just to give you a quick glimpse, as far as the universe, I would teach astronomy. It's never taught in our schools. And I would teach religion, which is able to be taught as long as. And so I teach astronomy and religion. Geometry would be taught from astronomy. The foreign language would be taught from the terms that one uses in astronomy, geometry, etc., etc. Everything would be interrelated. Everything would be connected. All the teachers would work together as a group of scholars. That's just a glimpse into it. I've got it all thought out.
Interesting. And different. Quite different.
Oh yeah, quite different. Only $1.5 million, Michael.
That's how much you need to get it.
To get it done.
To get it done? Where? In a pilot? In some pilot school?
Yeah, to do the curriculum, and mainly, and this is what I wanted to do when I couldn't be a director of curriculum, because I would get 14 outstanding teachers from New Jersey, and I would lock them up for a year, and we would write this curriculum.
14, interesting number.
Yeah.
You said that a leader can make all the difference in a school district. The superintendent is the leader of a school district. The current governor, Christie, has proposed capping superintendent salaries at $175,000 a year, the same level as the governor makes. Your thought on that?
I really haven't thought it through. I sound crazy, but I haven't. On one hand, I really believe in free market, and that you know, if people are willing to pay, I boggle at some guy that can hit a round ball with a piece of wood, making $15,000 a year, $15 million a year, when a teacher doesn't make $100,000. That boggles my mind. But I say, it's America. That's the way it is. That's the way it is. So, you know, for free market, and I guess that's where I would come out. You know, whatever people are willing to pay, they're willing to pay, and there should be supply and demand rather than trying to cap it. But I understand what he's doing. He's got huge problems, and he's trying to solve the problems.
What about another current issue, merit pay? There's a lot of talk in Trenton these days about the merits and demerits of merit pay. Do you have a view on it?
Yes, I'm for it. In fact, I had convinced Edie Fulton that she should do it back in our first term. And Edie got her head chopped off, as I'm sure if you talk to her, she would remember, because she went back to try and sell it to the NJEA, and they just would have no part of it, and just wondered why in God's name had she told Cooperman that in concept she was for it. So I think it can be worked out. I mean, in everything else they make distinctions. Why did you get your job? Why did Nancy get her job? Because you were evaluated and someone thought you were pretty good, so you got it. Maybe the criteria was objective and specific, maybe it was judgmental, but you know, you've got to make some decisions, and I think some people are better than others, and they ought to be rewarded for that.
You said that you tried to convince Tom Kean to take on consolidation of school districts through a high-level blue ribbon task force. I think since then we have gotten rid of the 23 or so districts that had no schools in them, and now we're down to about 585.
Yeah, big deal. Do
you think we should have county-based school systems?
I have to figure it out. You know, I go to Florida, and Jan and I go to Florida. We'll be leaving in another month and a half, and they have county systems. So, you know, I think it's Delaware or Maryland. The Commissioner of Education once told me I can meet with all the superintendents in one room. Can you meet with the superintendents in one room? I said, yeah. If it's Jadwin Jim or Atlantic City, I can meet with them all 590 or whatever it is. So, yeah, I think there should be consolidation. I know the argument for local control. I also know people do not want to give up their positions on school boards or superintendents. But there was someone by the name of Ruth Mancuso, and Ruth Mancuso was on the board when Fred Burke was commissioner, and she came out with a Mancuso report, and it basically said that all districts should be kindergarten through 12th grade. And I'll give you one example of that, why that makes some sort of sense. I was a principal of Belvedere High School in Warren County. We had 4 districts that were sending districts that reported to Belvedere, and each district wrote their own curriculum. Now, our science teacher in 9th grade could say, oh, I know where you're from White Township, because the science teacher there taught a lot of electricity. Or you're from Harmony, because you got a lot of biology. And so it was crazy. We had these 4 districts that fed into Belvedere. There was no uniform curriculum. And, you know, why not? Why not have, is that too much to ask, a uniform curriculum from K to 8th grade? So that when the kids come into 9th grade, there are certain understandings, there's certain things in science they've all had, in math and history and so on. So, yeah, I wouldn't have recommended it to the governor unless I thought it had benefits. And then as far as the monetary benefits, that would be the Blue Ribbon Commission would hack that out.
You mentioned the thorough and efficient education clause in the state constitution, which guarantees a thorough and efficient education for kids aged 5 to 17, I believe. Mm-hmm. And then the courts in the late 90s, the state Supreme Court, mandated pre-K in the Abbott districts, provoking criticism that it was rewriting the Constitution to embrace 3- and 4-year-olds, not just 5-year-olds. You have a view on that?
Yes, I think it's positive, because I started a mentoring program in Newark. I worked in Newark for 10 years. I was not...
After being commissioner?
Yeah, yeah. And I worked for a foundation, the Amelia Foundation in Morristown. And so I was not the commissioner, and therefore I would go in, you know, and people would lead me around the school, show me what they wanted to show me. Now it was just a guy going into the schools and into families. I had once made the comment that I had probably been in more African-American homes than any Caucasian in the state of New Jersey, because in this mentoring program I was in homes 2 or 3 times a week, talking predominantly to the moms. And when you look at the poverty, you look at the mobility, you look at the lack of a father figure, and you see these kids growing up and there are no books in the homes, and sometimes it's very, very difficult. And I remember, it sticks in my mind, I'm just pulling this right out. I can remember my first year as commissioner, and someone from the Trenton schools, when I was going through the schools, she said, "You know what you ought to do?" And I said, "What?" And she said, "You ought to be able to get the kids in kindergarten and make sure they know their colors and they know the difference between a square and a rectangle." And so she was saying to me, when the kids come in, they don't have the preparation to do simple things that we need to move them forward. So yes, I think pre-K is very, very important. I wish it were not so, but the realities are that the kids are behind, and they're behind when they're 3 years old, and they're behind when they're 4 years old. So anything that can be done to help them should be done.
When you were commissioner, there was also a Department of Higher Education, which Governor Whitman did away with in the 90s. Do you have a feeling about whether that was good or bad for the state?
I really don't have an opinion on that. It was at times difficult for me to work with the Chancellor of Higher Education.
Who was it?
Ted Hollander.
And why was it difficult?
I found him difficult to work with.
Okay. Well, just give us a little more of a sense of how the Department of Education and the Department of Higher Education stood in relation to one another.
Well, the whole idea of certification. Certification, rightly or wrongly, was put in the Department of Education because the teachers are going to be working in the public schools. So way back when, someone in their wisdom said the Department of Education ought to have this. Yet, the Department of Higher Education had a legitimate claim. It's our teacher education schools who are teaching these people how to be teachers. So you had an obvious clash there for turf, authority, policy, and so forth and so on. So, you know, sometimes I think a difference of opinion is good. It sharpens the debate and it makes for a better outcome. At times it's not productive and you just got politics and doesn't lead anywhere.
When you look back on those 8 years, were there any reforms that failed?
The merit pay never got off the ground. The takeover, which I only had 6 months, and we cleaned up all the excesses, the patronage, the money, the people that we put in jail who were working on summer homes for people, but we didn't have time to do the curriculum, which I really wanted to do, the heart of it, the learning. So I would say, you know, that really disappointed me that I didn't have a chance to work on that. And again, we couldn't get the tenure and the consolidation. That never got off the ground as a policy issue. But everything else, you know, Kane was, you know, in our working relationship was all I could have asked for.
He became known as the education governor. You derived some good feeling from that, I guess?
Oh, yes, yes. You know, when I see that some of the problems with a governor and a commissioner, and we hit it off. And I had great respect and admiration for him. I think down deep he's a policy guy. He's smart. He cares about people. He's not volatile. I never saw him really upset. And at times, I'd get in the hot water or something. And one story here. One time, I was kind of upset. I was going to see him. And I knew that he went out to stump for Lou Bassano, who was a senator from Union County. And he was helping Bassano get reelected. And I had just read in the paper that day that Bassano slammed Kane on something. It was strictly partisan, you know, because it would play well with...
Persona was a Democrat or Republican?
Republican.
Right.
And so I went in and, you know, I had to talk to Kane about education issues, but I couldn't help it. I said, you know, I just read about Lou Bassano, and he badmouthed you in the paper. Did you read that? And he said, yeah. And I said, and you've been going out trying to get him reelected? And he said, yes. And I said, he's a sleaze. And Kane smiled at me. He said, yes, Saul, but he's our sleaze. So, you know, nothing upset Kane.
Who did you work most closely with in the Kane administration?
Because we were doing a lot, he assigned a person to me, because on an initial thing, when I had all these things about teaching, and then suddenly he had a big agenda about teaching and education. So Daggett was the first person he put in. So I had a hurdle. I had to get through Daggett to get through Kane. And then after that, there was Marla Uselli. And Marla was then the education person. I had to go through Marla to get to the governor. And then finally, it was Rick Mills. And Rick Mills was my assistant. And this was like the relationship I had with Kane, which was wonderful. He asked me then who should be his next assistant when Marla left. And then I said, are you asking me? This person is supposed to challenge me and sift my ideas, and you know, before I get to you. And he said, no, that's okay. Who do you think that's really bright, would ask tough questions and so forth? And I said, Rick Mills. And so he said, okay, I'll interview Mills. So he interviewed Mills, and then Mills was my assistant, and he became the guy I had to go through to get to Kane.
Well, that works, doesn't it?
It did work. It was great for me.
Did you ever think about leaving early?
Sometimes when it was really tough and the pressure was hard, you know, I'd come home and I'd say, why did I do this? You know, that type of thing. But I never, I can take hits, so I never really thought of leaving. I got upset, I got down, but no. You know, it's like having Martin Brodeur in goal. I had Kane in goal, so he could stop shots.
What have you done in the 20 years since?
Yeah, I worked with Ray Chambers for Amelia in Newark, and that was 10 years. So that was the longest I ever spent in a job. And that was from the time I was, when I left in 90 to the year 2000. And I worked almost exclusively in Newark, and that's what I wanted to do, because a suburban kid, West Orange, and then all the districts I worked in were suburban. So I wanted to work in an urban area. So I worked there for 10 years, and then I started this program in Washington, which is kind of a big deal in the country. And so I did that.
What's it called?
New American Schools. And I was able to, I was on the board. I was the only educator on the board, and the rest of the board were CEOs. A guy named Schrantz, who was the head of Boeing, and there was a guy, IBM, his name slips my mind right now, Lou Gerstner, and people of that ilk. And so I suddenly was meeting with corporate type people I'd never met with before, so that was fun. And then in the last few years, I've been, I guess you'd call it retired or semi-retired. I started a company, and I was back to what I wanted to do again, teach teachers how to teach better. And I did that with a fellow Lafayette grad. He had called me on the phone and I hadn't seen him in about 25 years. He said, "Hey, Saul, let's start an education company." And I said no initially, and then did it. So we did that for about 5 years, and we just ended the company when he moved to Texas last year. And now I just published a book about my mentoring relationship with a young man in Newark. I've been mentoring him. Now he's a friend of mine. I met him when he was 8, now he's 21, and I wrote about us.
What's his name?
Well, in the book it's Eddie. His real name is Johnny. Now when he gives interviews, he says his name is Johnny, but when we discussed the book, writing the book, he said, "Mr. Cooperman, you won't use my name, will you?" And I said, "No, I'll call you something else." So.
When we were changing tapes, you said that you remembered a story about meeting with John Lynch, the senator from Middlesex County, when you were being appointed or when you were nominated, but before you were confirmed.
Yeah.
Want to tell us about that?
Sure. I was 2 hours into an interview, because you have to be confirmed by Senate, nominated by the governor, confirmed by Senate. And so they were asking me all sorts of questions. And then finally Lynch smiled and he said, "Well, I can say one good thing about you, Cooperman." And I thought, finally, a compliment. And he said, "You're the only one in Kane's cabinet that didn't give him a penny." And so I kind of smiled at that. I thought, that's a dubious compliment.
When you look back on the Kane era, how does it look to you? What should we remember about the Kane years in New Jersey?
I think just generally about Kane that he was, first of all, he had somewhat of Ronald Reagan. You couldn't get mad at him, even if you disagreed with him, because he's generally a likable person. He's a good man. He's a good person. So, it was a good time, a good governor, a good man who tried to do good as he saw good. And whether it was in education or whether it was in environment, this was a good governor. Yeah.